Well, good afternoon. I'm Pastor Cameron. This is Community Church, the Sermons in Si7, the Gospel of Mark. Well, today we finish up chapter 6 in verses 53 through 56, and this is what the text says. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let him touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Now, this is a huge contrast, right? How Mark chapter 6 ends is a massive contrast to how Mark chapter 6 starts. If you flip back with me to the beginning of Mark chapter 6, we find that really verses 1 through 6 are titled A Prophet Without Honor. So Jesus goes to his hometown, he goes to Nazareth, and they don't want to accept him. And it says that he could only do, right? He could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their lack of faith. And so that's how this chapter starts. And here in an area where they don't know him, or they've heard of him, they've heard of his signs and wonders and what he's done. He's just come off the feeding of the 5,000. Right, and so they know about him, and wherever he goes, they bring their sick to him. Now, it's interesting, right? So when they had crossed over and landed at Gennesaret, and so this is about a 3-mile wide plain, if you will, that is between Capernaum and Tiberias. And you know that Tiberias was the capital city of Herod Antipas, right? Now we know from Mark chapter 6 here that who put John the Baptist to death? Herod, right? So Jesus is not necessarily concerned about what Herod is doing, because we still think, you go into chapter 6 and you find that Herod is wondering who Jesus is, and he thinks that Jesus might have the spirit of John the Baptist with him, or on him, right? So Herod really doesn't know what's going on. But nonetheless, Jesus ends up there. They landed at Gennesaret. Now, what's interesting is the parallel verse here, the parallel story is found in John chapter 6. And after the feeding of the multitudes there, Jesus makes his disciples, he constrains his disciples to get in a boat and go. Right? Go across the sea. And they were headed, John tells us, that they were headed to Capernaum. Right? That's where they wanted to go, but they ended up landing at Gennesaret. Now, you know what happened during that time, right? The wind was buffeting him. The wind was coming back and forth. Jesus met them walking on the water. And we find, and what I think this leads us to, is that Gennesaret is not necessarily where they started, or where they were headed, rather. They were headed to a different destination, but life, the wind, kind of pushed them to where they landed. And I think that the application by way of principle for us today here is that sometimes we think we're headed in a direction, right? We have a destination in mind that we are headed towards. But then what happens? Life happens. The winds, the storms of life come against us. And what we think is they push us off course. Like, we didn't want to end up here. We wanted to end up in, where we were headed. But sometimes our plans shift by the circumstances in our life, which the Lord uses to push us into people's lives who need a touch from heaven. The Lord uses these winds, these storms, to push us into the lives where people need to be ministered to where you can stand there and say, let me show you Jesus. I know life stinks right now. Look, obviously stuff is going on because the people through the whole region carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was, right? They wanted their sick to be healed. And, you know, there are people around us like that. There are people around us in this world, in your world today, that are sick, that are depressed, that are discouraged, where we can meet them because we've been pushed off track a little bit by the storms that come into our lives. So they crossed over. They end at Gennesaret. People recognize Jesus. They run throughout the whole region, carried the sick on mats to wherever he was. They placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch the edge of his cloak. Where do we see that? We see that with the woman with the flow of blood. She was able to touch the hem of his garment and she was healed. It's interesting though that says, and all who touched it were healed. All who touched it were healed. This word here, right? This literally means, where it talks about we're healed, literally means we're being saved. And so what does that push us towards? That there is a personal faith relationship between the person who was touching Jesus and Jesus. Essentially, they expressed their faith in Jesus, and that's what he responded to. They expressed, as their faith launched them into desiring a touch from heaven, desiring a touch from Jesus, and that's what he responded to. He didn't respond to the fact that they touched his clothes. He responded to their faith. God bless. See you next time.